I just want to show you the slides that I most likely will be making up illustrations along with the specimens because they're a mess. They have a lot of good stuff, but I want to make sure it's not inherently it's confusing. When I put a marker on something or I put an arrow toward a reprint of one of these, I have to by nature accept more than one answer. It's just not. It's very hard, unless you really have a certain degree of expertise in computer graphics, which I probably could muster, but I don't really have enough, I think, to really be as good as some others are in doing that. So that's why I wanted to go over these first, and we'll start at A. Good to join us. Come on. It's all right. So these are just some of the slides, because I know we covered this, that I'm likely to use. For instance, normally I would write these down, but now I have them recorded, and it's a little easier. They would all come from here. Obviously, you have them. Even though I will use, I'm not 100% sure if I will use this one, but I might. Generally, I make the markings on the skull when I want you to identify the sutures. So it's important to name the sutures. I generally do not use this one, nor that. This is one of the ones I can use more than once, only because it makes, for instance, if I'm asking you about the orbit, I would just draw a box around that with an arrow and say, name four of the bones that comprise this structure. So you would be, so there would be just using it as a point of reference. You could also use it for any number of facial bones, zygomatic, nasal, mandible, anything along those lines, in the eye, because you have the lacrimal, any of those kinds of things, certainly the frontal bone. So, and obviously, we all of us get basically PowerPoints with these. I knew you were coming. PowerPoints with these images. We wouldn't want you to miss a Friday and a Monday together. Yeah, okay, yeah. It's okay. I'm taking a Friday off. No. I saw somebody get excited back there. Not this Friday, but a week from Friday, whatever that is, the 10th. More babysitting. It's a good thing. Except these are more interactive than feed me, change me. So, as I move it, like I said, very good chance we certainly use images to reflect the sphenoid bone. So sometimes I use this, sometimes I don't, but that's in play. We're going over the images and recording this as well. Wouldn't use that. Past that. Again, I don't find this as helpful as some of the others, but I mean, so I'll have a way of making you aware of what suture that is. Same thing here. I typically don't use this, although this is the best view if we're going to talk about the squamous suture, I think. We used to have a model, but I have this bone separated out, and I'll show you. At least here on these illustrations. The undersurface view is useful. If I use it, it would be for ones that are under the surface, such as the palatine bone. This is the vomer. This is the undersurface of the sphenoid because of color coding, particularly so for carotid canal versus jugular foramen, and even stylomastoid foramen over there. So, those are ones where you could use it for that aspect. This will definitely reproduce. It's the only way I can really easily show you the mastoid, styloid, and zygomatic processes and the meatus very well, and even the fossa. So it's easy to refer to those. And again, it is best to give me you're always better off with more information than less. So rather than just say zygomatic for that, you should include the term process. Okay, because zygomatic could imply that's the bone, and that could be misinterpreted. So I mean that's the kind of thing where you get half credit. And those add up. This is most exams are number right, so it's 50 out of 60, 52 out of 60. Correct. This is a wrong. So we look at the number of deductions. So if I deducted out of X number of points 5.5, I would round down. 5.5, 5 and 5.5 are the same. I don't round up to 6. You don't have to thank me. I do it for everybody. It's not because you're special. Backbone. So here is, this we definitely use. Because the only real way I can get across to you, sphenoid is one of those bones, you have a lot of anatomy, you could easily use it more than once. So, I mean, this is a much better way to see the zygomatic. And I printed in color, everybody. That'll be the weekend's project. My old HP Envy, busy. So I typically use the illustration and maybe a skeleton. So I might have 3 things pointing to the superior orbital fissure, or 3 things pointing toward the foramen ovale. And again, I use pipe cleaners, chenille stems. Everything is chenille stem. And then at the ethmoid, there's nothing really good, so I always use that. So that's the illustration that you'll see for that. I mean, I'll print both of these. Fairly easy to see. And I label them the best you can. And what I do, because my handwriting, is atrocious, the questions are typed. Okay, so I'll have that. And you're going to put when you come in next Monday, and I'll probably tell you again, you're going to put your backpacks and that kind of stuff along the boundary so we don't step on it. And then basically you just go from station to station. If there's 11 of you, I'll probably have maybe 20, 22 stations. And you'll just go and look around, starting when you get in. Just don't want to trip over anybody. You'll have a word bank, which effectively is the study guide again, whether I amplify it or not. You're going to have the answer sheet, which I print up, and your writing implement, and that thing in between, up there. So a lot of these are repetitive. Typically, I'd use just this for the mandibles, a lot of anatomy with that. And the rest of these, not a whole lot. I'm more likely to use the models when I do, because there isn't a lot of anatomy there. I typically use the models, and I'd rather a color illustration, though this would be clear. There's no anatomy but name that bone. So it's easier to do something like this. So you saw all of those so far. I think everything else is the same. I think everything else is things that you've seen before. I don't use that, or that one, or that one. And I'm not going to ask about the hyoid in advance, so don't worry about it. If anything, the hyoid becomes more relevant when we start looking at muscles and subsequently respiratory. And there's the orbit. I got to be perfectly good. If I wanted to reprint that and say orbit, you didn't even know it was the orbit. Or you just use this part. And then not doing the cavity or the sinuses, etc. Okay. So that one we're done with. We can X that out. Part B. Oh, there's joints. Part B over here, skeleton. We did this already, so I'll give you the illustrations again. I don't do the one with the curvatures is informational. That's more something you would ask on a test, as opposed to, try to put something up with primary and secondary curvatures. And the same thing, I'm not going to ask you about all the names of those ligaments. They're annoying. If you're going into a field where you're going to get it, in graduate school, you get much more detail if you're going in that direction. Is there fair game enough for nucleus pulposus and annulus fibrosus? I would use something like that. Phrase that question. A lot of them are just going to be very simple. A, identify the structure. A, identify the bone. B, identify the landmark. C, the landmark. D, the landmark. For here, it would be identify the structures. So that'd be more generic. So you'd have the annulus fibrosus, nucleus pulposus, And then, here's spinous process and transverse process. They'll be fairly straightforward. And some of the questions, typically they're going to have either 3 or 4 responses at each station. So I think it typically works out to around 80 total points. And you'll get, if you can only have like 10 deductions, you'd be looking at a pretty good grade. That would probably scale out to the A-, B+ range.
Is there a bonus question?
For you, no. For anybody else, no. Wait, hold on. I wish I got a bonus for doing my job. But at least you asked the question, which makes you maybe the second person in this whole class who's asked a question. No, I'm not going to use that. Definitely use this. Get ready for it. You're going to see it again. Don't you love it? That's a sort of a generic view for a vertebrae. Typically, if I use this, I also have a vertebrae that I label separately. That's why it takes me a little time to put this together. Most of Monday of next week, I'm stuck in here doing this. Dr. Robbins is going to be in here no later than 5, so we'll get out earlier than later. And he's got a bones practical along with some other stuff going on Tuesday and Wednesday. So if you're going to look at these things, it's easy enough. Somebody can let you in here on Wednesday. Dr. Hillwood can let you in on Thursday, rather. And I'll be here on Friday. And I'll be here on Wednesday, but he's going to be all set up. So if you need to look at these things, if you stick around for today, you're welcome to it. Until he comes in, we'll probably be done by 4:30, I would think. Okay. So there's a certain bit that's on you. Okay, and now for the cervical vertebrae, I don't find this to be nearly as helpful unless I can cut them out individually, like that. But I typically will give you I will have you hand identify the vertebrae. But I will likely use this illustration for the axis as well as having the bone. I will have, and that's the undersurface. I will have this illustration. That for the atlas was the first one for the axis, and particularly for that bad boy, the dens that's sticking up, or odontoid process. So I tend to reprint those. I don't use this one. So again, I rather than have all of these together because it's a little difficult to see, even though this kind of is one of the tells, the way that these articular facets go anterior, posterior versus medial, lateral is a big E. That's to do with all the force in the low back. But I would rather just have the vertebrae out there and let you identify them. And you will have to identify which one is cervical, which one is lumbar, which one is transverse, and which one is cervical, lumbar, and cervical. So you have a lot of repetition with these. Not there. Generally, I'm not big on the anatomy of the sacrum. I might ask what bone this is, and if anything, I would point probably, if there's a better view than this, on the bone or itself, to that auricular surface. And these are the intervertebral foramina. That's about it. You can see them in the back. These are the fused spinal area. Here's that auricular surface. You could use that. My inclination probably be to use the bone. I'll certainly use this diagram as well as using the model. Still the same diagram. It won't ask you that, or that, or that. And then I'll shuffle through these and I'll do the identification so we won't have to backtrack and do it. So again, to remind you, the connectors are part of the appendicular skeleton. We use the terms pectoral girdle or pelvic girdle. The pectoral girdle, by definition, is the combination, as we talked about last time, of the scapula and the clavicle. We did the clavicular anatomy and the scapular anatomy. There's not the clavicle is the clavicle, just know the bone. Okay, I'm not so worried about the acromial and the sternal end, but the scapula has a lot of anatomy. And you should take a look at that. That's one that you easily could use twice because you have the glenoid, the shallow, so-called, cup, such as it was. You have the spine of the scapula, the shoulder blade itself. You have the acromion process, the coracoid process. And then you have the fossa, that are above. You have the supraspinous fossa, the infraspinous fossa, subscapular fossa. You'll see the illustrations. And I do use those illustrations. Why are those important? Because that is the foundation for understanding when you get to the muscles what the rotator cuff is. And the rotator cuff. So again, pectoral girdle, shoulder girdle, clavicles, and scapula. Only side of attachment is there at that sternal clavicular area. Tons of mobility that's there. The socket does not. You're being generous to call that a ball and socket. The reason, and you'll see this when we get to joints, the reason that is defined as ball and socket is because what the joint can do. If you take away everything else, and you do this, what defines it is you're able to have motion in all three planes. Okay, frontal plane, sagittal plane, transverse planes. And that's defined by a motion called, we didn't get to that today, called circumduction. Circumduction, the best way to describe it is you can take your index finger and do that. Basically draw a circle. So effectively, it's almost like your upper extremity is tracing a cone. There. You might say, well, why doesn't this, because we have so much excursion in our index finger, really it really does not involve, when you study it mechanically, all three planes. There's more of a flexing and shifting. It's not really rotating all the way around. That's the fine point. Things that you think are moving in multiple planes are not. Okay, they're just shifting in two planes. Okay, that's physics. We know who to go to for physics. He's in a good mood. Liverpool are leading the league. Five wins, no losses, no draws. Winning every single one of them in the 85th minute or later. Is sick. All right, there you are. So again, I wouldn't use this so much. We're going to get to that part of it. Now, that's why I was telling you about this groove. That's where you see the biceps tendon, the intratubercular groove. This there. The clavicles, the way I know it's a clavicle. Clavicle. So I'm not going to use that. I'll have a bone out there for you to identify. I don't do the angles on the scapula. The anatomy we do. So you have to, if I'm going to ask it, I don't ask about the notch, as I recall, but the acromion, which sits higher in the anatomical position, the coracoid, big process. That's where that short head of the biceps actually goes. Even though that's set higher, but it's by definition, it goes up there. And here's that glenoid, and that's where the long head attaches here. So it's not about necessarily where it attaches, superior and inferior. It's about the length of the head and the head tendon combination. So that's all. I'm not going to ask you about the angles or the edges or the borders. Again, more anatomy here: supraspinous, infraspinous, and anterior to that. You see in the next illustration. Subscapular, spine of the scapula, really. This one I use to show you if I want to identify, I have arrow here, arrow coming here, arrow coming here. There you can see in the socket, it's not nearly as generous as that, just to sort of dovetail into joints. This is wildly exaggerated. That probably involves an over-exaggerated amount of the labrum, the lip, the fibrocartilaginous slip. It just isn't that. The golf ball tee is a better analogy. Not a whole lot. Ryder Cup this weekend. You know how they do quiet please and silence at golf tournaments? Good luck at Bethpage Black on Long Island with that crowd. it's going to sound like the Giants last night, booing Russ and begging for Jackson Dart. All the abuse those guys are going to take. Oh my goodness. I grew up it was a take no prisoners environment. At the old Yankee Stadium, my buddies' companies did business with several companies. One of them had tickets right behind the visitors on deck circle in a field box, like between me and Jenna to the where somebody would play for a catch and come for a foul ball. Oh, did those guys get abuse? It's very New York. Which brings us to where we start today, the humorous. Okay, I'll buzz through the illustrations and come back. And I will surely use this to amplify what's going on, okay? Because you need to be able to see this kind of a thing. I mean, it's because the models are beat up or they're not well defined. So, I mean, you get the option to refer to both. I very often I will use this, particularly to get to the distinction between the capitulum. This is the condyle, but it has a condyle that's lateral and a condyle that's medial. They have two different names, and they account a great deal for the motion that's unique around your ability to pronate and supinate around the elbow. So we'll get to that and use there. Same thing with the radius and ulna. Probably not that one specifically or that one. This gives you a little bit of an idea. When we get to the radius, there's very little of the ulna that's part of your wrist assembly. It's mostly radius, just from a joint particular thing. If you did not know it, a Colles fracture is a classic fracture. All of them have proper names. When somebody falls, instinctively you put your hands down. My wife did this, thankfully didn't fracture. When we were in West Virginia, climbing up these steps, she put her and she goes, "Oh my God, my wrist is killing me." She had her wrist and her side, and I was concerned she didn't. So examining, I was pretty sure she did not. Very common because you put your hands down. Elder people sometimes they reverse it because they can't get their hands. The reactions are slow. They can't get it. So it's the distal radius that usually goes up. Colles if it goes down before it reverses. Very common fracture. And so we look at the hand. This is the critical piece here, these guys. Because as you'll come into, I'll go over it again, the hand and the foot are very similar. Okay? These are called carpal bones. When you have anything beyond that, beyond carpus. And in the foot, you have tarsal bones and metatarsus. The difference in the hand is the metacarpals are comparatively short as compared to the phalanges. Those are the actual digits of the fingers. And the foot, the metatarsals are longer. Okay, your forefoot is longer, and your toes are relatively speaking shorter, the phalanges, which you have the same number. 5, 4, 3, and 2. So whether it's your pinky finger or your little toe, and your fourth, the third, and your index finger or index toe, if you want to think of it that way, have 3 of these: proximal phalanx, middle phalanx, and distal. The thumb and the big toe only have 2, proximal and distal. So you have 14 on each side. That's why arthritis is so interesting, hands and feet, because it's inflammation of joints. Where are most of the joints? Extremities. Okay. Particularly, we see hands and feet predominate in the most common of the inflammatory, true autoimmune or inflammatory arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis. That's where it presents. Small joints, hands and feet. Osteoarthritis, the old age arthritis, we'll get to this in the unit we're doing now. Basically wear and tear, big joints, big bones. Grandma's knees, hips, shoulders. That's why I kind of creak around here some days. Another opportunity. Oh, Dr. Stein, you get around so well. I just told Dr. Hillwig, I'm celebrating on the 9th. I won't be here, but I'm celebrating. And I will be here. That's Thursday. My sister will be 80. How about none of you have an 80-year-old sister? No. I know your sister. She's not 80. She doesn't even look it. Not a day over 75. Okay, 73. I'm terrible. And we'll get a little bit, that's more, again, that's a little bit more in the joint related aspect. We'll talk about the carpal tunnel that's there. And then that's the upper extremity. And so really the only thing that's left in the lower extremity is the hip, femur, tibia, and fibula. And just identifying the bones respectively in the wrist, carpus, and in the ankle, the tarsus. And so the hip itself, and again, this is where this gets important. That's when we're talking about the symphysis pubis. That's that fibrocartilaginous pad. The give, without that give, it's already difficult enough, depending on a woman's frame, to be able to give birth vaginally. This effectively, and hormones are related that tend to relax that to a certain extent to facilitate the birth process. Just enough. And we'll get into the anatomy of that a little bit here as we move on. So I might use this sort of generically because you can identify bones and parts of bones themselves. And inevitably, I will have one of these. I'll use this illustration with 3 different bones, 3 different colors. They all participate in this called the acetabulum. That's the large distinctive socket that's there. Here's that auricular surface that you can see over here. And each of these has, if you go on to study, this is in the internal aspect of it, all of these have mirrors. This is called the sciatic notch, greater and lesser. What passes through it, the largest by diameter nerve in your body, the sciatic nerve. It's there. The spine is sort of created by the passage in between them. This is called the obturator foramen, and that's really a large foramina on either side. Muscles, tendons, vital structures pass through there, etc. Just to get you. And so anytime you see these, important things attach. So those are anatomical landmarks. For instance, in my trade, we looked at a lot of limb length discrepancies. And you would measure, this is like you can palpate this in the front. You're standing up. That's called the anterior superior spine. You'd measure it down, and you'll see the inside of your ankle bone is the medial malleolus. And then you'd measure on the right and on the left, and you measure from the umbilicus to the right and on the left. And you see if there were discrepancies. Sometimes it's a limb length discrepancy, which is forgivable in children, with maybe a half a centimeter. In adults, when you get in adults and you get getting close to a centimeter, it's a problem because it really walks imbalancedly. And then you also want to determine whether it's a pelvic tilt or whether it's limbs. Okay? And that tells you whether you have to make shoe adjustments for the lift in a shoe or not. I had very good fortune with that because I tried to visualize every one of those folks I saw. I was good at what I did. I was just a lousy businessman. So we'll look. I don't go into much. This is, again, if you go into more advanced studies, we'll look at the pelvis itself. That's there, the pelvic inlet and the pelvic outlet. So they call the false pelvis, because it's just sort of bones that surround it and open up. It's really, it doesn't have that brim, this inlet. And basically now you're beginning to deal with aspects of childbirth. So inferior to the brim, and it's the start really of the birth canal. And then the inferior margin of it is for that. I mean, so in classic anatomy, you learn those kinds of boundaries, but you can gather. This is why I'm spending a little extra time with this now before I go out and see the bones. Is forensically, this is significant. This femur and pelvis are the significant bones that can give us a lot of information as to whether these are the remains of a man or a woman. Because they're adapted for childbirth or not, period. So we're able to measure. Here you can see this is the brim. You're going to see this is all the crest of the ilium. That's sort of the base of that crest. perimeter around by the symphysis pubis all the way in the sacrum. And then if we flip it upside down, you can see the same thing. The coccyx plays a role. Those ischial spines play the role. They're not large, but think they are an obstruction to a delivery. And we think of people who are very, it isn't necessarily small in stature so much, it has to do with more of the pelvic construction. This is part of it. And they give you, and this is a really good set of illustrations. We measure this. You'd only need one. This is bilateral and symmetrical, same on both sides. And you're measuring this to see whether in the male, this is much more in an acute angle. In the female, we call it the pubic arch. So the pubic bone is this small bone here with a wing and a wing that comes together. Very small comparatively speaking. So it only comes up a little bit comparatively. Okay? And they come together in the symphysis pubis. So if you look at one and you can find that angle and just effectively double it when you measure that angle, you can determine whether it's 80 to 90% more rounded or much more acute, 50 to 60%. That gives you a lot of information, because what that translates to in the female, tilted forward, the true pelvis defines the extent, should be a T, of the birth canal. The cavity of the true pelvis is broad and shallow and has greater capacity. See, this one is not tilted the same way, much more the heavier build and torso that's part of it. The pelvis is narrow and deep. And there's some really good illustrations. Look at this. So in the female, here you can see when I talk about the tilt going this way, here being more upright, judging by where the sacrum. But look what that does. It creates a much wider opening. It's here. You can see how narrow that is if you look at the tip of the coccyx in proximity to this is called the ischial tuberosity, which you're sitting on. So, and guys, it's comparatively close. In women, not so much that are there. And so now you can look at the undersurface a little bit more and notice the rounded nature versus the not so much. This sort of heart shape versus more oval. Here. Really significant. And it manifests itself in the women generally have center part wide at the pelvic area. That has to do with the head and neck relationship of the femur. So the head and neck of the femur, as it gets closer to 90, it's more likely female. As it gets, it's like 125, 135 degrees. If you see so I mean, you measure that, most likely it's a male, I would say. Things like that. But if it's like at that 125, here's 90, figure it out. You got another halfway to the next 180. 125, 135. Female, much closer to that right angle, relatively speaking, and that basically goes along with having, sort of a stance to get wider in that location. Now, in forensics or equipment, you see these things. You never can tell where your life's work will take you. Even though my mother and you may disagree, I was a national teacher, I didn't figure I'd end up in education. You never know where the future leads. You never can tell when you might be involved in something like this. Whatever your eventual fields of endeavor are. And so you can see some of it, and so basically the main hip ones that I showed you, the colored one with the parts of that's what I probably use as much. The femur you've got to use a lot. I'll certainly use these illustrations as well as using the bone itself, not that. I'll use this for the tibia and fibula. I have enough feet that, basically I would use something like this, as well as the model itself. And those are everything I'll be using illustrations wise. Again, I'll print them up in color, I'll label them, I'll have it all laid out here along with this. It's a good hour to 2 hour setup. annoying though that is. Maybe I can get a pass and come in on Sunday. We'll see. Let's get back to where we're going with this. So we started here. This is, when we get to the arm assembly, it has this one bone. The analogy is the same when you're talking about an analogous structure, similar to, albeit a little bit smaller to the lower extremity. We have a lot of models as well as bones. They're in various shapes of repair or addition. It's relatively good. I don't do right signals, so you won't be able to figure that. You just give me the bone. You have to tell them which right gene or how do you get the bone? So this is not bad. So this one I would probably use. And basically, I label it. I don't know what. Okay. Whenever you see a hollow area, it's possible. This is called the electrodon faucet. So it fits in there. So make it look. One day, I will reorganize this a little bit after that. So here it is. I'll get a humerus, so it fits in there. This portion, this is the electron. That's going to push me back to the other. So the same is true. You'll see the faucet is posterior. Same thing when you look at a femur. It's called the popliteal faucet. This area in between the condyles or intracondylar faucet, and it's just a bone. So those are always going to be posterior. That gives you a clue as to what side it is. And you can see both of these, same deal, they're together. Little neck. You can begin to see it has a head, there is a neck. It just so happens because the head is not as distinctive as the one on the femur, that can't really, the head and the neck almost, the head ends and the neck begins. Unlike with the femur, where you have a very distinctive neck section. And I don't ask you to distinguish it, but a lot of textbooks will have you, what is the surgical neck and the anatomical neck? Anatomical neck is immediately behind the head, wherever it is with the anatomical neck. The surgical neck has to do with the kind of bone. That's it, yes. So it's not really an anatomy and physiology portion. I mean, it's a surgical anatomy portion. Still looks good. Where'd you go? Radius, where's it going? Radius. It's not very good, but here's one. I'll find another one that works better. One of the models. So let's look over here. The anatomical neck just behind the head is there. And then you see where the sites are that are part of it. And you see the surgical neck, most frequently fractured part of the humerus, kind of goes behind that area, a little bit more proximal to the outer bigger part, distal. And I'll show you, so let me show you the structures that we're going to look at first. They're not reflected well in this specimen that you look at them. Again, it's kind of beat up. Here you're looking at the anterior aspect, here you're looking at the anterior there. You have the tubercles, greater and lesser. You would think it has to do with size. Really, it's more having to do with position. In the anatomical position, this is the greater tubercle, even though it's the lateral aspect is higher and then lesser is lower. In between them, you have the intratubercular sometimes called the bicipital groove because of the biceps. On the outer aspect, you can see it roughened here. This is deltoid tuberosity. Tuberosities or tubercles are generally smaller. Tuberosities are generally larger, but they're roughened bones where they are attachment of muscles. That's the deltoid. The big muscle you have here, that's where it attaches. It starts with the spine of the scapula, back here, and then it goes mostly lateral and somewhat posterior. Basically, what it does is this. This is rotating external. That's the deltoid tuber. Those are important then. Okay, lesser tubercle, greater tubercle head. The fracture is probably around this area because of the surgery there. Okay, that's to the bone. Side one inside. As you go distally, you have these two prominences that are there. They are technically condyles covering cartilage, because you can feel how rough it is here, how smooth they are there. This is called the trochlea. This is the capitulum. And then remember, I was talking about where there were epicondyles. These are epicondyles. Normally they're very small. That is not the case because all on your part, we use our pronate, we supinate so much, we use our arms so much, do mostly flexor activity. This is called the medial epicondyle. Most of the major flexor tendons of the flexor wrist and your fingers all start there. Called the common flexor. You feel it. Palpate that you feel it's called the common flexor motion. You're doing the opposite, you can feel here. It's the common extension. Flexors are more powerful than extension. So you get somebody with a tennis elbow, it's epicondylitis because it's pulling from one of these, depending on whether it's more on the forehead or back. That part of what you see is epicondylitis. This is the structure where you hear famously about Tommy John surgery, where the ulnar collateral ligament was involved. And it's going down, I know I have a bad one. It may not be the right one for this, probably not. But it's kind of going from here to here. And that's the one that we mentioned. And take a look at here. Very little athletic. But if you see the way these professionals now go for about 95 miles an hour, the torque that they put, and they're spinning it, oh gosh. You can imagine how much there is. It was surprising. Most of them, I had a student interview when skates came up that first this summer, but I was last time, you wrote about, when my other student was Tommy John surgery now, you got them. No. They're adult and haven't done it until just this past year, so I mean, there's no, you can't timetable on it. But at least, and interesting, like I said, they're using that same kind of dynamic brace as opposed to that. So those are the important structures. And what happens is trochlea, like a pull. I don't know if you work with police physics, and it's sort of like wide on the edges and deep in the middle, so holy shape. That's not name for trochlea. And if you feel inside here, that's not a great one. It's got like a mated surface. And that ridge here, with usually there's a little bony prominence there. Two of them marry to the stone. So it really is a joint because of the, and this is a joint that makes you elbow. That's why if you lock your elbow, because if you lock it at night, you can still pronate and supinate. This the joint between the radius and the ulnar is really as pure of a hinge as we have anywhere. The other one is called the capitulum. It's like a cap that goes on this mushroom kind of cap guide. That's the head of the radius. And because of that, what happens is the radius rotates. Everyone should pronate. So you have the radial head, you have the tuberosity here. This is the radial tuberosity. This is tuberosity where your big biceps, brachialis attaches. This, people say that my wife, well, I hurt my wrist bone. No, it's usually one of these. So they are effectively We call it styloid. So when you figure your wrist bone on your wrist, that is the ulnar styloid, this is the radial styloid. That's usually on her wrist, it's really distal aspect. It's really distal aspect of the ulnar that's impacted. Posteriorly, again, you have that notch, and that notch receives this is called the electron process. So this is the process that receives that process, the electron process. You can see obviously the back of the medial epicondyle is always dramatically larger. And that bad boy, that little notch between the medial epicondyle and the start, effectively that fossa with that prominence as part of trochlea posteriorly, that's where your ulnar nerve passes. So it's your funny bone. You know, a lot of people, it ain't humorous. I wonder if you came about it. A lot of people it's easy to remember. I just did it. You did it just the way you feel. Pressing that nerve will send a set, basically send sensation down towards your fingers, in particular your fifth and some of your ring. It is a lot harder. It's a lot. It takes a lot of complexity in my experience. Who says I couldn't do this? There you go. You get this. Make it look good. So here, up close and personal, there's other anatomy here. You're going to see that limits when we get to, for instance, this. It's not well defined here, but there's a ridge. That ridge, that's like a bone. When bone meets bone, it stops moving. The same thing here. When bone meets bone, it stops moving. So people don't, when they hyperextend an elbow, it hurts right away. Very often what can happen is you can fracture the electron. So hyperextension is just that. The knee is the same way. Something's got to give. In the knee, usually you're going to have soft tissue damage, damage to the posterior, so one of the internal structures that we disrupted. Here, bone meets bone is stopped. The same thing prevents it through hyperflexion, bone meets bone. So that's an anatomical stop. There's a name for this, they call it the coronary fossa, not that terribly improvement of the radial fossa. Those are like natural bony stopping points for the foot and the trochlea. So here you can see the coronary process. Up here, that little extension that's there. And again, the head of the radius, the head of the ulna is rather narrow and shallow way down here. You see both. Here's that radial tuberosity again. The biceps brachii, and I think the tendon of the brachialis. The two muscles that make up the keep it. I am under instructions. As soon as we get done with all these babysitting things that we have to be doing, guess where I have to get my skinny posterior to? That's right, back to the gym. She often refers to that in less anatomical terms and more colorful language. I should have listened to my dad. So here, and this is where it mimics two bones. One, they're similar, but the radius you would have to be there is a little bit thicker in nature. The ulna may be a little bit thinner. The big thing with the ulna and how to remember it is that U-shaped area, the trochlear notch that fits in that trochlear process. So, I mean, I think U for that and U for ulna. Don't forget the olecranon back there. Again, they're held together. It's better than I'll show it to you. Okay, all those little things that are there. Again, they're called styloid processes. The thing that is not, I wish I had a better one. Oh, good. That bothers me. I can't find that. Oh, this is all. Here's it. Go. Here's a oh my God. You almost feel it here. This is the area, it's designed for this. I mean, it demonstrates, even the bones are in terrible condition. This area is called the radial notch. You see is the head of the radius, and the radial head rotates around. This is a joint called a pivoting, but we only have two of them. Where the axis of the atlas allows us to do this, and what allows us to move the pronate and supinate our forearm. That area is called the radial notch. The ulna has a notch, but it's not really a big deal. It's distal and it's very hard. The radial notch is covered in cartilage because it's a joint in and of itself. So you can see it here, and I'll try to find a good one. So here's the head of the radius, and what it was pointing to, if you go and look at that with those older bones, those yellowish bones, that's the radial head, that mushroom cap. It rotates or pivots around that notch. So you have the olecranon, the radial notch. Here you have the radial head, the radial tuberosity, the radial styloid, and here's the ulnar styloid. But so the head of the radius is proximal, where the head of the ulna is distal. Okay, and so I undoubtedly will print this up, considering that none of it's very good. They show it to you a little bit better here. Okay, and now the bones. Let me go back. You have 8 bones that make up, and at least here, let me in here. Oh, learn to count. I tell you, what alarms me, things I need, are not where they're supposed to be. Another one that we had something to look again up to this obviously. So that's can't get. Years without sitting guest in the first show. This one. Spell backward. Nice. This is another one coming up. Get ready. There are 8 bones. Name. How do I remember these 8 bones? Basically, you look at them in rows. So this is the radius. So we usually look medial to lateral. We're going to do lateral to medial. Let's stay over here. And here's the ulna next to it. So the ulna has a very, very small bulk bed. They're connected by the interosseous membrane, but this one has a fair amount of give to it. So, and then you have that radial styloid and ulnar styloid. The bones fit in 2 rows. So, and they really are important. You see, I'm drawing them like this. The reason I'm drawing this is scaphoid, lunate, triflexural, and that little T is trapezium that are there. And then the next row has trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. Okay, so pardon the handwriting, but that's what it looks like. How do I remember those names? So you take the first initial, SLTPTTCH. This is the acronym. You mind? Everybody use. Thank goodness I have a crowd that appreciates something, because I didn't invent that. So the best way I understand I'm not going there. I want to keep the job. I got a couple more years to work. I figure if I make any comments after this, and you're going to run to that. This is the first uniform response I've seen. And people protested too much. Shakespeare had it all that. Okay, so you can figure it out by the rows. Scaphoid, if this curves this way, I mean, you can see it in the inverse. That's there. So you have it inherently have a curvature. You start here. The scaphoid, if you imagine it, you can't get it. It's the highest of all the bones. So it's like a scaphoid. So the scaphoid here, okay? And then you begin to proceed from there. Lunate was next here. Scaphoid here. Lunate there. Who's able to go I have no idea what it is. Pisiform is a sesamoid bone. So this is an actual, this is the real stuff here. In a tendon. So it really is not part of it, it's the heel. Sort of like the base of your hand. The heel of your hand is really more about here. And we'll get to, we go back just a little farther over here, that's what. So that's the first one. So it's, if we call it sesamoid bone, it's really not part of the part that moves, goes side to side. It really creates a very interesting joint that we can move. We can flex and extend AV duct to AD duct. So it doesn't rotate terribly well, but other than that, it has a lot of mobility, as you all know. And then the distal row has the trapezium, is a very unique bone. You're going to see, I can't obviously take that, you'll see the illustration, it's a saddle-shaped bone. And so, and the base of the first metacarpal is like the reverse of the saddle. So this would be the saddle on the horse. This would be something that should be molded into that saddle. This is sort of a part of these non-Euclidean geometry. It doesn't, Euclidean, great figures that it's non-Euclidean, it's not composed of parallel lines, or similar to typical solid geometry. So it doesn't fit where it's supposed to. Does that make sense? So it's a non-Euclidean figure, and you know that, but effectively it's, that saddle joint is almost, again, it doesn't completely go around. It's movements that are mostly in two points, the shifting along. So that allows you to approach your gun. And so real big problems exist when you hurt this. Now, when you break the base of your, break it into here, any of these, but hardly short ones, they're very, very easy to become like really kid. So I mean, we really get worried about them, particularly the thumb. I mean, you need that. I mean, if years gone by, you would amputate a big toe. And there's nothing unusual about that. So trapezium, trapezoid, capitated. And the one that you can tell, it's all by shape. So here's trapezium, trapezoid, capitated. Hamate is the one with that, which you call the gill. Notice the hamulus on it. So you can see that. I will have that model out. I will also use the illustrations. And then phalanges here you have to identify, as a group, metacarpals, maybe a proximal and distal or proximal, middle, and distal phalanges. They like speed, being singular. We're getting there. Carpal tunnel. If you flip that over, that cavity, and it spells a little bit more of muscles, you have tunnels that are there. So that, again, because of that curvature, if you put, and we do, like soft tissue, there are little tunnels that are designed for tendons, and in the middle, it's called the median nerve. We'll get to that when we look at the peripheral nerves, which isn't that terribly far away. So in between these tendons, ones that will help you move your wrist this way or that way and flex it slightly or bend your fingers down, is the median nerve. That's the main nerve to all the flexor structures. Hand surgeons call it mother median. It's the single most important nerve that you have going there. That's the one that gets impinged. The tunnel, it doesn't have a free excursion. A lot of times it's occupational. It's why they made all these ergonomic keyboards. Years ago, truck drivers used to drive and have their wrists right on the thing. That was the way they got it. People were working jackhammers, a lot of mechanical, before we had as much automation as we do. All of those things, it was all over the place. So much so that in order to get permission to operate on, you had to be able to show that the nerve was impinged. You have to do what's called electromyographic studies, which interestingly we can do, we can simulate in our lab in physiology, and we do a lab with something like that. Long story short, it's a really nasty, but I have elements of it. Most people do. You get to a certain age, you can tap it, and you feel like needles and pins. I can still do all those things. When I can't do it in this hand, I was wearing a glove. When the semester started, my arthritis kicks up down in here. Just saying. Now, we're almost done. Here you have the hip bones. I call them hip bones. Some people call them coxal bones. The original name was os coxae. I don't know the derivation. And they form that pelvic girdle. It's really the fusion of the hip bones. The sacrum certainly plays a role. But again, that's part of the axial, not the appendicular skeleton. And that's a very, very strong attachment point. We have any number of these that really show you how anchored it is. These are these auricular surfaces, and both of these really strong. To me, this is part of it. See how this proximity to show the illustration short oxide to the histotuberosity. It's all about stability as opposed to being mobile. So if you take any one of these specimens, even ones kind of beat up, like this, you'll be able to see it. 3 bones that fuse as one. So we have 3 named bones. So if you're looking at here, we're always going to get the widest part of the histotuberosity you're sitting on. That's the opposite of the brain. This is the acetabulum. That's a socket. The mom said, "What's a socket?" Or a socket. That's a socket. Sure. It's unbelievable how sturdily that goes. Takes some doing to dislocate it. It doesn't take a lot to dislocate it. It's pretty easy. Okay, a variety of things. There's something on Chief's state report. We ran into. Talk about not having as much exposure. Travis Kelce. You're going to marry someone who's a believer. I suppose you can lose your. Tell me when we come. We gave him a discount earlier. I should have the highest paid word. It's okay. Giselle makes twice as much money as me. Nevertheless, we have all 3 of these bones. Ileum, IL, IUM. We have ileum in your gut. Ischium, big histotuberosity. The one that doesn't have a whole lot of anatomy, you have your pubis, that's one of these synthesis. They all participate in the acetabulum. Okay, look at the joints, we'll go over some more specifics about that. You can see some of these structures. So, this is the iliac crest. Put your hands on your hips, the iliac crest. You feel that sort of bump in the front, but I'm just getting there. How big now? That's called the anterior superior spine. Below it is the anterior inferior spine. You'll see this when we talk about muscles. There's a long muscle groups. That's here, the rectus femoris, big muscle, and rectus and straight, femoris is for your femur. It plays a role in the knee jerk. So, I mean, we know that there's significant attachment. Spine, obviously, not a very good view of it, the radial surface. Greater, lesser sciatic notches. There, again, VSQ2 velocity. They're all important landmarks that are part of the femur. We have a lot of femoral. I said 2001 Space Odyssey we had. Vancouver. Ringing a bell? Educate. Cooper, Stanley Cooper, was a height, fairly young, 137 years old. It's some of the greatest movies of all time. He incorporated, his first movie incorporated classical music to a lot. And this was a landmark movie that it really was a space novel that went back to earlier times, suggesting the airplanes. So many physical plans goes back and shows our ancestors, our more gorilla-like ancestors, simian-like ancestors. I don't want to get fair to the rest of the group. Like the old joke. I'll be a monkey's uncle. You are a monkey's uncle, but we're going to keep your relatives out. That's what Marx said. So, basically, it shows these anthropoid ancestors out there running, and somebody amazes them, somebody picks up a bone and starts whacking, and that brings us all the way from modern days to space days. It's very interesting to see all done to classical music. So that, and that's the bone. This is the longest and strongest bone in your body. If you measure one of these, whoever this person was, pretty tall, multiplied times 4, you're up against it. Has a head, has a neck. This is both an anatomical and surgical matter. So it's unlike, say, a much more distinctive neck. This opening is called the fovea. The fovea is capitis femoris. This is the part where the blood supply comes into the head. Superior ribs. These are called trochanter. The only bones that have trochanters, greater and lesser. Okay, this is the intertrochanter bone. This roughened area is where the large gluteal muscles are. Those are the gluteal tuberosity. The beauty of the lower extremity, everything's big. Again, the notch is always going to be posterior. You know they had points in the midline, so this is a left. So you can see that, again, gluteal tuberosity. This is called the linea aspera. Large muscles called mass in the anterior thigh. Again, they make up part of the knee jerk. That's the lateralis medialis. Join here and pull on that and create this line. Linea aspera line. These are condyles. This is the intercondyle fossa. This is part of the conjugative, which is the top of the fossa. We bring everything into it. This talar surface, talar rise with this, talar rise with the femur, not with the tip. So here you have the condyles covered. These are the epicondyles. The medial and lateral ligaments. Medial here, that's here into a similar roughened area on the tibia. That's the big anatomy of all of these things. You should be familiar with that. Spike is not allowed to stay with the patella. The patella Since, again, the ligaments are a tendon, in this case, it's in the quadriceps tendon, where there's four muscles in the anterior thigh join the four muscles called the quadriceps tendon. They surround and engulf the patella, which kind of forms it, and the extension of the patella, okay, patellar tendon, that's the lesion. It inserts into this roughened area, it's quite large, bump in front of your knee, or up to lower your knee, from the tibial to rostrum. This is the tibia, the big one, TB, the big bone, the fibula, by no means small, actually probably longer, but indeed not the big one, despite its overall budget. Please do not tell me tibia and tibia. We're not getting these. Will happen. The patella has an articular surface covering the cartilage, where, as you see, it participates in the knee joint, and a roughened area is involved, the aforementioned quadriceps. The condyles are quite flat. That's where the menisci come in. They create basically these gasket-like structures, deepen it, and create sort of a mini cup to receive the body response to this. Normally, they give us nothing to grab onto, that we can flex and extend, and what this allows, what those cups do, it allows us to internally rotate. That's really what you can see that joint. You watch somebody walk, or you watch them running, particularly you see if they have the Olympics and things like that. And they put their contact down, even when the knee assembly rotates in just a little bit, that sort of unlocks that extremity. So the weight can be transferred more uniformly. If you're very stiff-legged, there, the fibula really does not participate in the joint, but, okay, plays an important role as sort of structural support. Tibia has, this is called the tibial malleolus, or medial malleolus. Some people say malleolus, that's wrong. But if you want to say it, that's really like the styloid process, just like the wrist. The fibula has one as well. The fibula has very little anatomy, has a head, and there's a tiny little line that fits under. It's fairly easy to see where it is. And then you have this, with a little bit of cartilage on this side. Because this has a subtle amount of participation in the ankle joint. Well, most of the ankle joint is tibia. We'll go here, this is what it is. More about that in just a second when I get it out. I have Biol. See a big couple. Sits on here. So the combination, as you see here, the tibia and fibula, forms the true ankle bone. That's what I was talking about connection. This is called the talus. This sits on the highest. This is the calcaneus. That's the calcaneus tuberosum. You walk, you directly go through here. This little notch is caused by this little ridge where we see the insertion. There's actually a little bursal side. So it's here, which we tend to go. This is moving surge. This is called the navicular bone, and this is called the cuboid. These three bones are called cuneiforms because they look like kind of the writing in ancient writings. Sort of, you remember the color panel outline. Cuneiforms of that, right? What is an hieroglyph? What did I do? Yay! That's my girl. Oh, God. I am married to the most wonderful person. She's the one who made the mistake, not me. I wouldn't have married me. And it's an absolutely true story. She was having, you'll hear about her facial pain. Looked at at UPMC by a neurosurgeon. This terrible nerve impingement. And he's sitting there examining her. I'm in the room, and we weren't even married, engaged. And he's going like, the guy he had the personality of the tabletop. You run into doctors. Some of them, they are just so darn. There's nothing. They're just thinking about the job. They really don't have and you don't hire a surgeon for their personality. You hire them to do the job. This guy didn't have it. And he's He says, do you have any visual problems? And I look at her, and I look at him, and I go, of course she does. Look who she's with. She can't see. And the guy finally cracked up. Self-deprecating humor, it's useful. When I retire, you're allowed to use these in your field. No one will understand them. I'm impressed that somebody remembered 2001: A Space Odyssey. The movie that came out when we were in college. We used to go see 2001 under the influence. Statute of limitations again applies. Okay. The movie that came out that was X-rated X-rated then doesn't mean what X-rated means now. Okay. The movie that came out was called A Clockwork Orange. Very, very famous movie. So, I showed it in a drugs in the human body class at La Roche, which of course I had to get permission because unfortunately there's a rape scene in there. So it's going to be very, very troubling. I don't know how that would play in today's politically correct world, but it's a very, very interesting movie about what he was contemplating. The guy who wrote it, of a future society that would have been around now. In England, that was Anthony Burgess. It's sort of like with 1984 with George Orwell. You're starting to look at what their concern about what a futuristic society, brave new world, Aldous Huxley. It's a wonderfly interesting movie. It's very, very well done. It was the first time we really saw exceptional Malcolm McDowell, who's so much older now. Brilliant music, Beethoven. So here we are again. Again, I use this. You know the names of the bone: ilium, ischium, and pubis. Of the anatomy, for our purposes now, you should know what the crest is. The anterior and posterior spines, good idea to know where they are. The notch. I'm not worried about the gluteal lines. That's on the posterior area. That's where the gluteal muscles are. Or the iliac fossa. The auricular surface, I don't worry about the arcuate line. I learned about that anatomy when we were studying lower extremity. I had to know every freaking indentation and tiny hole in the entire lower extremity. I was taught by a man who was considered in his last teaching year the world's leading expert on lower extremity anatomy. 5 days a week, 4 hours in class, every freaking Monday through Friday for 10 weeks, because we're on trimesters. So, and again, the ischial tuberosity, I think you should be familiar with. Not much with the pubis, I would say. Do know about the obturator foramen, that large opening, and we'll get to the rest of this as it's relatively. And I do use this illustration, certainly the acetabulum, as you can see, part of all three bones. You went over all that. You won't have these illustrations. I mentioned that for context. Again, up here, I use these illustrations. You will see trochanter's, the head, the neck. Here you can see that linea aspera. Here you can see on the posterior aspect, you have the gluteal tuberosity. Again, posterior will always have that notch, that's intercondylar notch or fossa. Again, patellar surface where it articulates the condyles, patella itself. Not much for the tibia. What's not pictured here on the tibia that I didn't mention are this, the intercondylar eminence. It's like two little bumps that you can see here. And we have some of these with it, if I can find one. That's important. They form here where the cruciate ligaments attach. Cruciate ligaments come from the femur superiorly, just inside those condyles from a roughened surface, and they insert or attach here in between the condyles. So we call it the intercondylar eminence or tibial tubercles. But really, for you to know about them is where, when we took at joints, where the cruciate ligaments attaches. Tibial tuberosity, this interosseous membrane, unlike the radius and ulna, very rigid, doesn't have any give. This is an example of what a fracture would look like. This is called a bimalleolar fracture. Some authors call that, the proper name is called a POTS, P-O-T-T' fracture. You see a lot of those. I mean, that's the kind of fracture you would, if James Conner and I didn't see the play at all, you get so much, you can see the obvious fractures there. Hopefully it was not an open fracture. But one of those happened in football very famously to a guy who had been the quarterback of, the Redskins when they lost in the Super Bowl to Oakland. The Oakland Raiders back, John Madden, that was the Super Bowl he won for you Madden enthusiasts. Named Joe Theismann. Joe Theismann was from Notre Dame. He planted his foot, and what ended his career, Lawrence Taylor, arguably the best defensive player I've ever seen. Menace, tackled him. His foot was planted. It came at a right angle. Not only was it became such a bad fracture, I think it was an open fracture. Taylor immediately is going nuts, trying to get people up from the sideline, and ended his career. Similarly, that happened to the guy who Patrick Mahomes displaced in Kansas City. Was a guy named Alex Smith, who was number 1 overall draft choice. Some guy named Rodgers was number 20. He had some good years with Washington. He had one of those fractures that was like this, with the bone was exposed to air. He nearly lost his leg from infection. He had like 13 procedures to save his leg. Now he does analysis, commentary. So this is where know where those malleoli are. And there's the bimalleolar fracture. Again, very common in sports. Again, you don't have to know all of this. The names of the tarsal bones, principally the talus and calcaneus. I'll get for the next one. Again, hallux is the name we give to the big toe, pollex to the thumb. That's more relevant when we look at naming muscles. Like we call this the extensor hallucis, this tendon. Extensor pollicis is part of the longus, and there's one called the brevis. That little indentation that you can see here, I'm sure everybody could make by just doing the hitchhiker type thing. I love that. That's called the anatomical snuff box. What does that have relevance when I see the term snuff? Most people would thought that stuff, like Copenhagen and skull. That was an alternative. Tobacco caused worse cancer, mouth and tongue cancer. When tobacco came over, it wasn't smoked, it was ground fine and inhaled. It was called snuff. That was the original way we used tobacco when it was brought to Europe. Then later it was rolled into cigars, or basically cigarillos, okay? And then it was eventually smoked, if you're interested in the history of that. Like I said, for that drugs course I did where I showed the movie, that was part, we were there they were using hallucinogenic drugs to reprogram this career criminal's mind. It was really the basis of what that was all about. But they would put stuff here, and go watch old movies, you'll see that. Oops. So here they are, the ones to know. The talus, the trochlea, again, saddle shaped is where it happens to, which accounts for a lot of the ability to move your ankle. The calcaneus, the calcaneal tuberosity, navicular and cuneiform, you don't have to worry about the cuneiforms, they're just bones. They create that wedge. This area is called the tarsal metatarsal junction. When you heard about that, is known as Lisfrank's joint. When you hear in sport about a Lisfrank's fracture, which really is a career ender, that had a lot of those are very hard to recover from. Here it is from the side. Here's the tuberosity where you walk on. That's where the Achilles tendon inserts. This is the joint they had to fuse, insert with Tiger Woods. He had that terrible accident. He nearly lost his leg. He had so much problem. I think they eventually had to fuse this joint. Because you just couldn't really. It'd be hard to imagine how he could swing a golf club. Still, yeah. And don't worry about the arches. Don't worry about that. All right. If you want to take a look at the bones, you have some questions, take the little time. It's almost 4:30. I appreciate your patience in listening to somebody blab.